I'm Ethan Marshall. I'm 38 years old. And 3 months ago, my wife, Lauren Marshall, sat across from me at our kitchen table in Cedar Grove, Ohio, with her arms folded and her jaw set in a way I hadn't seen before. And she told me I had absolutely no say in who she spent time with, that she was an independent woman, that she did not need my permission to walk out her own house at midnight. And as she said it, she held my gaze without blinking, like she had already rehearsed the speech in her head 100 times and was just waiting for the moment to deliver it. We had been married for 12 years, 12 years of shared mortgages, school recitals, late-night arguments about bills, quiet Sunday mornings drinking coffee on the back porch while cicadas hummed in the trees behind our fence. And I always believed that whatever storms came our way, we would at least face them together. But that night, something in her tone felt final, not angry in a heated way, but cold and resolved, like she had already stepped halfway out the door emotionally and was simply informing me of the new rules. The argument had started small, the way they usually do, with me asking where she was going when she grabbed her purse close to midnight and said she was meeting friends. And I remember glancing at the clock on the microwave and feeling that subtle twist in my stomach, because Lauren had never been the type to wander out that late without at least mentioning it beforehand. I told her I wasn't trying to control her, that I just wanted to understand why these late nights had suddenly become a regular thing over the last few weeks. And she laughed in a short, sharp way that didn't sound like her at all, and said I was acting paranoid and old-fashioned. I had noticed the changes building up slowly before that confrontation. The way she guarded her phone like it contained state secrets. The way she would tilt the screen away from me when notification lit up. The sudden burst of energy late at night, when she would shower and put on makeup as if she were heading to a party instead of a casual drink. And each time I tried to bring it up, she accused me of imagining problems that weren't there. I told myself I was overthinking it, that marriage goes through phases, that maybe she just needed space. But deep down there was a low, steady hum of dread that I could not silence. When she said she was an independent woman and didn't need permission, I felt something shift inside me. Not anger at first, but disbelief, because I had never treated her like property. I had always supported her career, her hobbies, her friendships, and I thought mutual respect meant keeping each other in the loop, especially when you share a home and a life. I tried to explain that it wasn't about permission. It was about partnership, about basic consideration, about the fact that when she leaves at midnight, without a word, I lie awake staring at the ceiling imagining worst-case scenarios, and she rolled her eyes as if my concern was an inconvenience. The house felt different that night after she left, the ticking of the hallway clock echoing louder than usual, the refrigerator humming in the background while I sat at the kitchen table staring at the empty chair she had occupied just minutes before, replaying every word she had said and trying to pinpoint the exact moment our marriage had started to fracture. I remember the early years when we could talk for hours about nothing, when she would reach for my hand across the table without thinking, when we were a team in every sense of the word, and I struggled to reconcile that version of us with a woman who had just walked out as if I were some obstacle she needed to push past. I realized then that it wasn't just about midnight outings or independence. It was about the growing distance, the way she spoke to me like an adversary instead of husband. And as I sat there alone in the dim kitchen light, I understood that whatever was happening between us had already crossed a line, and whether I wanted to admit it or not, our 12-year marriage was standing on ground that no longer felt stable. The change did not happen overnight. Even though looking back it feels like someone flipped a switch and replaced my wife with a stranger, because it began subtly after she joined a social media group called the Phoenix Sisterhood, a private online community led by a woman named Vanessa Cole, a twice-divorced lifestyle influencer from Columbus who built her entire brand around reinvention, empowerment, and what she called burning down the old version of your life to rise stronger from the ashes. Lauren found the group through Brittany Shaw, one of Vanessa's closest allies, and soon she was also following Megan Reed, another loud voice in that circle, and all three of them constantly posted about cutting off dead weight, refusing to shrink themselves for anyone, and living unapologetically no matter who got uncomfortable in the process. At first, I did not think much of it because Lauren had always enjoyed motivational content and self-improvement pages, and I figured this was just another phase of inspirational quotes and filtered selfies. But within a few weeks, I noticed her language starting to shift in ways that unsettled me, because she began using phrases that did not sound like her own thoughts, but like slogans lifted directly from Vanessa's live streams, talking about how women are conditioned to serve and how true growth requires ruthless boundaries. She would sit on the couch scrolling for hours, nodding to videos where Vanessa described husbands as anchors holding ambitious women back, and I could see something changing in Lauren's expression, a kind of hardening that made me feel like I was slowly being recast as an obstacle rather than a partner. Soon the nights out began increasing. First once a week for what she called sisterhood meetups in Columbus, then twice, then 3 times, until suddenly she was out 4 nights a week. leaving the house dressed in outfits I had not seen her wear in years, heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor while I stood in the kitchen trying to keep my voice calm as I asked when she would be home. She would roll her eyes and say she did not need to provide a curfew, that she was reclaiming her autonomy, that marriage did not mean ownership. And by the time she started coming home at 1 or 2 in the morning on a regular basis, the atmosphere between us had become thick with tension that never quite dissipated. Each time she walked to the door in the early hours, smelling of perfume that was stronger than usual and sometimes faint traces of alcohol, I would ask where she had been, not in an interrogating tone, but in the same tone any spouse uses when routines change drastically, and she would immediately accuse me of being controlling, of policing her movements, of trying to clip her wings because I could not handle her growth. The words felt rehearsed, almost identical to phrases Vanessa posted online about insecure men who fear empowered women, and I began to realize that our private conversations were being filtered through the ideology of a group that saw every disagreement as oppression. I watched as Lauren grew more distant, her phone constantly buzzing with messages from Brittany and Megan, their group chats lighting up late at night with plans for rooftop bars and weekend retreats, and whenever I expressed concern about how exhausted she looked or how little time we were spending together, she would say I was trying to guilt her into shrinking back into a version of herself she had outgrown. The house felt emptier even when she was physically present because her attention seemed permanently redirected toward the sisterhood, toward Vanessa's carefully curated world of dramatic rebirth narratives and bold declarations about severing ties with anyone who questioned your journey. What hurt most was the speed of it all, how quickly 12 years of shared history seemed to lose weight against a few weeks of validation from women who framed every compromise as weakness. And as I lay awake most nights waiting for the sound of her car in the driveway, staring at the ceiling while the digital clock ticked past midnight, I felt less like a husband and more like a cautionary tale being rewritten in someone else's empowerment story. I tried to approach it calmly because the last thing I wanted was to become the caricature of the suspicious husband that Vanessa's posts constantly mocked. So one evening when Lauren was actually home before midnight, I sat across from her on the couch, kept my voice steady, and told her I needed honesty more than anything, that if there was someone else I would rather face the truth than live in this constant fog of doubt. She looked at me with a mixture of irritation and disbelief and said there was absolutely no one else, that I was projecting my insecurities onto her transformation, and that what I was witnessing was simply her rediscovering herself after years of playing supportive wife and mother. She spoke about growth and identity as if those concepts automatically erased the basic expectations of transparency in a marriage, and I listened carefully, trying to separate my fear from actual evidence. But even as she denied any infidelity, the tangible details around me kept piling up in ways that refused to be ignored. New dresses began appearing in the closet. Styles she had never gravitated toward before, tighter cuts, brighter colors, pieces that looked less like casual meetups with girlfriends and more like curated outfits for attention. There was a new perfume on her dresser that carried a sharp floral scent I did not recognize, stronger and more deliberate than anything she used in the past, and she wore it almost exclusively on nights she claimed were simple sisterhood gatherings. The financial discrepancies were harder to dismiss because numbers do not rely on feelings, and when I noticed unfamiliar hotel charges on our shared credit card statement, my chest tightened in a way that words cannot fully capture. I confronted her gently at first, holding the printed statement in my hands and asking for clarification, and she brushed it off by saying the group sometimes rented conference rooms at boutique hotels for workshops and that I was twisting normal expenses into something sinister. Her explanation sounded rehearsed, delivered without hesitation, and for a moment I wanted to believe it because believing her meant preserving what little stability remained. That fragile belief shattered the night I checked their public posts, something I had avoided doing, because I did not want to spy or validate the narrative that I was controlling, but the constant disconnect between what she told me and what reality suggested became too loud to ignore. I scrolled through Vanessa's page and saw photos from rooftop bars in Dayton, neon lights reflecting off cocktails, Brittany and Megan posing with exaggerated confidence, captions declaring girls reclaiming freedom and shedding outdated expectations, and there in the background of several images was Lauren, wearing one of the new dresses she had claimed was for a quiet movie night at Vanessa's apartment. The timestamps matched the evening she told me she would be at Vanessa's place watching films and decompressing in a safe, empowering space. And as I stared at those images, my stomach dropped, because it was not simply about bars or drinks. It was about the deliberate rewriting of her whereabouts. The contrast between her calm assurances at home and the public celebration of rebellion online felt like two entirely different realities colliding, and I realized I was being asked to accept explanations that did not align with visible facts. When I brought up the rooftop photos, she accused me of stalking her friends, of invading her digital privacy, and said that sometimes plans change spontaneously, that empowerment meant not having to provide a minute-by-minute itinerary to a husband who could not handle unpredictability. Her words carried that same rehearsed cadence I had grown accustomed to, echoing the sisterhood's rhetoric about autonomy and resistance. And in that moment, I understood that the real wedge between us was not just late nights or hotel charges, but the growing gap between truth and narrative, between what was happening and what I was being told was happening, and the space between those two realities was becoming too wide to bridge with calm conversations alone. The breaking point came on a Thursday evening when Lauren walked into the kitchen with an air of forced casualness and announced that she would be attending a 3-day wellness retreat at a luxury spa resort in Asheville, North Carolina, describing it as an exclusive adults-only reset designed to elevate her mindset and recalibrate her life. And she made sure to emphasize that it was non-negotiable, that she had already paid her portion, and that she deserved this experience without having to justify it to anyone. She spoke in a polished cadence I had come to associate with Vanessa's live streams, weaving in phrases about boundaries and self-investment. And I stood there listening with a calmness that surprised even me, because inside something had already settled into place. In the past, I would have argued, would have pointed out how sudden these trips had become, how the pattern of secrecy and inconsistencies was eroding whatever trust we had left. But that night, I simply nodded and said, "Fine, your choices are yours." And for a split second, I saw a flicker of something cross her face that looked almost like disappointment, as if she had been bracing for resistance that would justify her narrative of being held back. Instead, I offered none of it, and the silence between us felt heavier than any argument we had ever had. What she did not realize was that the shift inside me had happened weeks earlier. The night I printed out the credit card statements and saw the pattern clearly laid out in black and white. The night I opened my laptop and began saving screenshots of her public posts where she posed without her wedding ring. Captions carefully worded to imply independence and rebirth. Lines about shedding old identities and stepping into a new chapter, phrasing that hinted she was already living as if she were. Unattached, I cataloged dates, locations, timestamps, cross-referencing them with the explanation she had given me. And the more I documented, the more the inconsistencies formed a narrative of their own. I had already scheduled a consultation with a divorce attorney named Robert Hayes, a measured and deliberate man whose office overlooked the courthouse square. And during our first meeting, I laid everything out methodically, not in an emotional outburst, but in a structured timeline of events, screenshots, financial discrepancies, and documented statements that contradicted her public persona. Robert listened without interruption, occasionally jotting notes, and advised me to continue gathering evidence quietly to avoid confrontation that might escalate into allegations that could complicate proceedings. His advice was clinical and practical, devoid of sentiment, and hearing my marriage reduced to strategy and documentation forced me to confront how far things had deteriorated. So when Lauren stood in our kitchen speaking about Asheville as if it were a pilgrimage she needed to undertake for her own awakening, I did not argue because the argument no longer mattered. I had already begun emotionally detaching, already pictured a version of my life where late-night anxieties and contradictory explanations were no longer constants. I noticed the way she packed for the trip with meticulous attention, selecting outfits that felt more curated than relaxed, slipping her ring into the jewelry box on the dresser before zipping her suitcase closed, and the deliberate removal of that small band felt symbolic in a way she probably assumed I would not notice. As she described the spa resort with its mountain views and detox sessions, I watched her carefully, recognizing that the dynamic had inverted, that the power she believed she was reclaiming was already shifting in ways she could not see, because while she was preparing for 3 days of liberation in Asheville, I was preparing for something far more permanent, something built not on rhetoric or social media captions, but on documented reality and legal counsel, and the quiet acceptance I offered her that night was not surrender, but the final confirmation that I had reached my own point of no return. While she was away in Asheville, posting filtered photos of mountain sunrises and spa robes draped over balcony chairs, I stayed in our house in Cedar Grove surrounded by a silence that felt strangely clarifying, and on the second night of her retreat, my phone rang with an unfamiliar North Carolina number that I almost ignored until something in my gut told me to answer. The man on the other end introduced himself in a hesitant tone, explaining that he had met my wife at a downtown Asheville bar earlier that evening and had learned through conversation that she was married, a detail she had not shared while telling people she was single and rediscovering herself. He said he had noticed her ringless hand and later found one of her public posts that still listed our last name, and something about it had not sat right with him. So he tracked down my number through a mutual acquaintance who recognized her from social media and thought I should know. I listened without interrupting, absorbing each word with a calm detachment that surprised me, because by that point the shock had already worn off and been replaced by a steady sense of inevitability. He described how she laughed easily, how she introduced herself without hesitation, how she spoke about freedom and new beginnings, and none of it sounded like the woman who had stood in our kitchen insisting this trip was about wellness and growth. When the call ended, I sat at the dining table staring at the wall for several minutes, feeling not rage, but a quiet confirmation that every instinct I had been documenting was grounded in reality. That same night, I logged into our joint bank account and looked at the balance of $42,600 that we had built over years of careful saving. And with a deliberate steadiness, I transferred exactly half into a separate account in my name, not out of spite, but out of practicality, ensuring that whatever came next, I would not be left scrambling financially. I printed the confirmation, added it to the folder where I had been keeping copies of statements and screenshots, and then walked through the house slowly, taking in the familiar details of a life that had once felt secure. I packed only essentials, clothes for a few weeks, important documents, my laptop, and a small box of personal items that held meaning to me but would not be missed immediately, and with each drawer I closed I felt a growing sense of resolve rather than hesitation. Before leaving, I sat at the kitchen counter with a pen and a sheet of thick stationery, and wrote her a handwritten letter explaining that independence is a choice, but so are consequences, that partnership requires honesty, and that I had reached a point where I would no longer compete with narrative that erased our marriage while still benefiting from its stability. I kept the tone measured and factual, avoiding accusations or emotional outbursts, because by then the decision was not about proving a point but about reclaiming my own boundaries. When I finished, I folded the letter neatly and placed it on the counter beside my wedding ring, the small gold band catching the overhead light in a way that made it look almost foreign, and leaving it there felt less like a dramatic gesture and more like closing a chapter that had already unraveled. I locked the front door behind me, loaded the last bag into my car, and began the drive to my brother Tyler's place in Indianapolis under a dark sky that stretched endlessly ahead. And by the time Lauren's retreat ended and she returned to Cedar Grove, expecting to step back into the same dynamic she had left, I was already miles away, no longer waiting in the kitchen for explanations that had stopped meaning anything at all. She came home from Asheville a full day earlier than she had originally planned, and I found that out not through conversation, but through the sudden explosion of notifications lighting up my phone while I was sitting at my brother Tyler's kitchen table in Indianapolis. The screen filling with missed calls, frantic texts, and voice messages layered one on top of another asking why the house looked half empty and where I had gone. Her messages moved rapidly from confusion to panic, each one more emotionally charged than the last, as she described walking into bedroom and seeing empty hangers, noticing that my laptop and document were gone, spotting the bare space on the dresser where some of my personal items had been, and finally finding the envelope on the kitchen counter beside the ring I had left behind. She sent photos of the letter unfolded on the counter, as if proving she had read it, and her tone shifted from disbelief to desperation within minutes, telling me she had made the worst mistake of her life, that the retreat had been overwhelming, that she felt pressured by the group dynamic, that she had lost sight of what truly mattered. I read each message slowly without responding, noticing how quickly the confident rhetoric about independence had dissolved into pleas for stability once the consequences materialized in physical form. Within hours, she had posted emotional selfies on her public page, eyes red, mascara smudged, captions about clarity hitting too late, and learning lessons the hard way. And the irony did not escape me that the same women who had flooded her comments days earlier with fire emojis and declarations of rebirth were now conspicuously silent. Vanessa's page continued, as usual, with curated affirmations about resilience. Brittany posted a filtered brunch photo. Megan shared a quote about accountability, without tagging anyone, and the digital sisterhood that had amplified her transformation offered no visible support once the narrative shifted from empowerment to loss. Watching that silence unfold reinforced something I had already understood, that encouragement is abundant when rebellion feels glamorous, but far rarer when its consequences become tangible. 2 days later, there was a knock on Tyler's apartment door that carried a sense of inevitability, and when he opened, I saw Lauren's sister Amanda standing beside their mother Carol, both wearing expressions that blended urgency with controlled indignation. They stepped inside without much preamble, their eyes scanning the modest living room as if assessing the situation, and Amanda began speaking immediately about misunderstandings, about how Lauren was distraught, about how marriages endure rough patches, and how walking away so abruptly was drastic. Carol's voice trembled with a mixture of disappointment and appeal, describing Lauren as confused, overwhelmed by outside influences, insisting that this was not who she truly was. I listened without raising my voice, sitting upright on the edge of the couch while Tyler remained in the kitchen within earshot, and when they paused, I explained calmly that this was not about a single impulsive error made during a spa weekend, that it was about weeks of deliberate choices, documented inconsistencies, financial decisions, and public declarations that reframed our marriage as something already discarded. I told them that independence includes accountability, that presenting oneself as single while still sharing a home and finances is not a momentary lapse, but a pattern, and that I had reached my decision after careful consideration rather than emotional retaliation. Amanda attempted to reframe it as pride getting in the way of reconciliation. Carol spoke about forgiveness as a virtue, but I maintained the same steady tone. Clarify that forgiveness does not require continued exposure to behavior that undermines trust, and that stepping away was not punishment but preservation. By the time they left Tyler's apartment, their urgency had softened into quiet resignation, and as the door closed behind them, I felt not triumph or bitterness, but a firm certainty that what had unfolded was not one isolated mistake, but a sequence of calculated choices that had led exactly to this outcome. A week later, I received a message from Lauren saying that Vanessa, Brittany, and Megan wanted to meet me in person to clear the air, framing it as an effort to fix what had spiraled out of control. And against my better judgment, I agreed to meet them at a coffee shop halfway between Indianapolis and Cedar Grove because I wanted everything said face-to-face rather than filtered through captions and curated posts. When I walked in, the three of them were already seated at a large table near the window, their posture confident, but their expressions noticeably less triumphant than the images they projected online. And as I approached, I could sense that this meeting was less about reconciliation and more about damage control. Vanessa spoke first in the same polished tone she used in her videos, explaining that Lauren had been vulnerable, that the sisterhood was about growth, not destruction, and that sometimes people misinterpret encouragement as pressure, carefully positioning herself as a mentor who had simply been misunderstood. Brittany leaned forward and insisted Lauren had been influenced by the excitement of the group dynamic, that none of them had intended for a marriage to unravel, and Megan added that if Lauren chose to distance herself from the sisterhood, then I should recognize that as proof of commitment and take her back without holding the past against her. I listened quietly until they finished. Then I reached into my bag and placed printed copies of their own public posts on the table, screenshotted captions mocking husbands who question late nights, posts celebrating cutting off dead weight, videos where Vanessa described divorce as the ultimate act of self-actualization, and images of Brittany and Megan toasting to freedom after broken engagements and contentious custody disputes. I pointed out the consistent pattern in their messaging, how every disagreement within a relationship was reframed as oppression, how accountability was repackaged as insecurity, and how they publicly encouraged women to detach emotionally long before making practical decisions. I did not raise my voice, but I spoke clearly and methodically, explaining that Lauren's choices did not emerge in isolation, but were reinforced repeatedly by a culture that glamorized rupture without discussing aftermath, and I told them that I refused to become a case study in what I described as their empowerment experiment. I said that marriage is not a laboratory where you test slogans against real lives, and that encouraging someone to publicly imply separation while privately maintaining shared finances and security was not empowerment but recklessness. Vanessa attempted to deflect by saying every adult makes her own decisions, but I reminded her that influence carries weight, especially when packaged as mentorship, and that celebrating rebellion without responsibility creates predictable consequences. The conversation ended without resolution, their composure thinning, as they realized I would not be persuaded by a last-minute narrative shift. And within a month of cohesion they projected online began to fracture visibly. Personal scandals surfaced one after another. Brittany's ongoing custody dispute became public. Megan's engagement ended abruptly amid accusations of financial dishonesty. And Vanessa faced criticism when former members shared messages revealing private encouragement to dramatize marital conflicts for content. The sisterhood's comment sections turned from celebratory to combative. Alliances shifted publicly, and the same platform that amplified their unity became the stage for its unraveling. As I watched from a distance, I felt no satisfaction in their implosion. Only a quiet confirmation that movements built on spectacle rather than substance eventually collapsed under the weight of their own contradictions. And by then my focus had already moved beyond their circle and toward rebuilding a life grounded not in slogans, but in stability. 3 months after I filed, we stood in a quiet courtroom at the Franklin County Courthouse while the judge reviewed paperwork that represented 12 years of shared history, reduced to signatures, and notarized statements. And the entire hearing lasted barely 15 minutes from the moment our case was called to the moment it was finalized. There was no dramatic exchange, no raised voices, just a formal acknowledgement that the marriage had irretrievably broken down and that the division of assets had been agreed upon. And when the judge confirmed the decree and moved on to the next case, it felt less like an explosion and more like the final click of a door closing softly, but permanently outside the courtroom, in a hallway lined with polished tile and muted conversations. Lauren asked if we could talk privately for a moment, and I agreed because by then I no longer felt anger, only clarity. She looked different from the woman who had declared her independence at our kitchen table months earlier, her posture less defiant, her voice unsteady as she asked if I still loved her and whether there was any possibility we could start over from scratch without the noise, without the influence, without the rhetoric that had surrounded her during those months. I listened to her carefully, recognizing vulnerability in her tone, and I answered honestly without cruelty or hesitation, telling her that I loved who she used to be, the version of her who believed partnership was strength rather than limitation, but that I could not build a future on a memory of who she once was. I told her I wished her growth for herself, not for me, because growth that depends on reclaiming what was willingly discarded is not growth at all, and that my decision was not about punishment, but about recognizing that trust, once fractured so thoroughly, does not regenerate simply because regret appears. She nodded slowly, tears welling but not falling, and for the first time since this unraveling began, there were no rehearsed phrases, no borrowed slogans, just two people acknowledging the end of something that had once been meaningful. 6 months later, my life looked different in ways that felt grounded rather than reactive, because I had been promoted at work after months of focusing my energy on stability and performance instead of conflict, and I moved into a downtown condo in Indianapolis that overlooked the city skyline, a space that felt intentional and calm rather than tense and unpredictable. The quiet evenings were no longer filled with anxiety about unanswered texts or contradictory explanations, but with a steady routine that allowed me to think clearly and plan deliberately. I began dating someone who was kind and grounded, someone who valued transparency over theatrics and consistency over spectacle, and the contrast between that steady presence and the chaos I had left behind reinforced a lesson I had learned through experience rather than slogans. There were no dramatic declarations about freedom, no performative displays of independence, just mutual respect expressed in small, consistent actions that required no audience. When I think back to the night Lauren demanded total independence, insisting she needed no permission and no oversight, I no longer feel bitterness, because in the end I did exactly what she asked. I gave her the independence she claimed to want, and in doing so I reclaimed my own. The peace that followed was not loud or triumphant, but steady and undeniable, rooted in the understanding that sometimes the most powerful response to demand for freedom is simply to step aside and allow it, fully and without resistance. 3 months after I filed, we stood in a quiet courtroom of the Franklin County Courthouse while the judge reviewed paperwork that represented 12 years of shared history, reduced to signatures, and notarized statements. And the entire hearing lasted barely 15 minutes from the moment our case was called to the moment it was finalized. There was no dramatic exchange, no raised voices, just a formal acknowledgement that the marriage had irretrievably broken down and that the division of assets had been agreed upon. And when the judge confirmed the decree and moved on to the next case, it felt less like an explosion and more like the final click of a door closing softly but permanently. Outside the courtroom, in the hallway lined with polished tile and muted conversations, Lauren asked if we could talk privately for a moment, and I agreed because by then I no longer felt anger, only clarity. She looked different from the woman who had declared her independence at our kitchen table months earlier, her posture less defiant, her voice unsteady as she asked if I still loved her and whether there was any possibility we could start over from scratch without the noise, without the influence, without the rhetoric that had surrounded her during those months. I listened to her carefully, recognizing the vulnerability in her tone, and I answered honestly without cruelty or hesitation, telling her that I loved who she used to be, the version of her who believed partnership was strength rather than limitation, but that I could not build a future on a memory of who she once was. I told her I wished her growth for herself, not for me, because growth that depends on reclaiming what was willingly discarded is not growth at all, and that my decision was not about punishment, but about recognizing that trust, once fractured so thoroughly, does not regenerate simply because regret appears. She nodded slowly, tears welling but not falling, and for the first time since this unraveling began, there were no rehearsed phrases, no borrowed slogans, just two people acknowledging the end of something that had once been meaningful. 6 months later, my life looked different in ways that felt grounded rather than reactive, because I had been promoted at work after months of focusing my energy on stability and performance instead of conflict, and I moved into a downtown condo in Indianapolis that overlooked the city skyline, a space that felt intentional and calm rather than tense and unpredictable. The quiet evenings were no longer filled with anxiety about unanswered texts or contradictory explanations, but with a steady routine that allowed me to think clearly and plan deliberately. I began dating someone who was kind and grounded, someone who valued transparency over theatrics and consistency over spectacle, and the contrast between that steady presence and the chaos I had left behind reinforced a lesson I had learned through experience rather than slogans. There were no dramatic declarations about freedom, no performative displays of independence, Just mutual respect expressed in small, consistent actions that require no audience. When I think back to the night Lauren demanded total independence, insisting she needed no permission and no oversight, I no longer feel bitterness, because in the end I did exactly what she asked. I gave her the independence she claimed to want, and in doing so I reclaimed my own. The peace that followed was not loud or triumphant, but steady and undeniable, rooted in the understanding that sometimes the most powerful response to a demand for freedom is simply to step aside and allow it, fully and without resistance.